6 years ago, 2 days before Christmas, my mother called me and said 8 words that split my life clean in half. Don't come home. Serena needs peace. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said it. I was in the break room of the small marketing firm in Seattle, where I'd just started working 3 months earlier, holding a paper cup of burnt coffee that tasted like regret. Someone had plugged in a plastic Christmas tree on the counter, and the cheap string lights blinked unevenly, one bulb already dead. There were dollar store ornaments hanging crookedly from the branches, and a half-eaten tin of butter cookies open beside the microwave. It was ordinary, harmless. And then my phone rang, and everything shifted. When my mom's name flashed across the screen, I smiled automatically. That's what I did. No matter how many times a conversation left me feeling smaller, I still answered like a hopeful child. "Hey, Mom," I said brightly, already stepping into the hallway for privacy. I was just about to leave early. I finished that campaign draft, so I thought I'd start packing for the train tomorrow. There was no warmth in her response. "Kayla?" Just my name, flat, administrative, like she was confirming a dentist appointment or canceling cable service. My stomach tightened. "What's wrong? Is Dad okay?" "Your father's fine." A pause. I could hear papers shifting on her end, like she was referencing something written down. "Listen, I've been thinking. Don't come home for Christmas." For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. I let out a small, confused laugh. "What do you mean? Don't come home." "Serena needs peace," she repeated, as if that explained everything. "She's overwhelmed. The baby isn't sleeping. She's barely holding it together. She can't handle tension." "Tension?" I repeated, my fingers tightening around the phone. "I haven't even talked to Serena since Thanksgiving." "Exactly," my mom said sharply, "and I'd like to keep it that way. You know how you get." The hallway suddenly felt too narrow. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed like angry insects. "How I get?" I asked quietly. "Mom, I asked her why she didn't tell me she'd gone into labor. That's not tension. That's normal. I'm her sister." "You always have to make things about you," she snapped. "Serena doesn't need questions right now. She needs support." "I am supporting her," I insisted, hating the pleading edge creeping into my voice. "I bought gifts. I bought my train ticket weeks ago. I took time off work. I get a refund. It's non-refundable." "Then eat the cost," she said, and there was no hesitation in her tone. No acknowledgement that I wasn't made of money. "Serena is postpartum. She's fragile. You understand?" That word, fragile, hung in the air between us like a verdict. Serena was fragile. Serena needed protection. Serena needed peace. And I, apparently, was the opposite of peace. I was the disruption, the complication, the problem to be removed. "Mom," I tried one last time, my voice barely steady. "Are you really telling me not to come home for Christmas?" "Yes," she said simply. "It's for the best." Then the line went dead. I stood there staring at my phone, my reflection staring back at me from the darkened screen. My face looked blank, like someone had erased the emotion before I could process it. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just felt something inside me slide quietly out of place. Back in the break room, my coworkers were laughing about Secret Santa gifts. Someone was arguing over whether Die Hard counted as a Christmas movie. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. I walked back to my desk and sat down without taking off my coat. The email drafts on my screen blurred together. The world kept moving, but I felt like I'd been quietly uninvited from my own life. Because this wasn't just about Christmas. It was about a pattern I'd been pretending not to see. Serena had always been the center of gravity in our family. The miracle baby, the sensitive one, the one who felt things deeply. When she cried, everything stopped. When she struggled, plans changed. When she lashed out, it was stress. When I reacted, it was drama. I thought about being 15 and making varsity soccer after training all summer, only for my parents to skip my first game because Serena suddenly didn't want to attend a sleepover and needed emotional support. I thought about my college graduation, scanning the crowd for their faces and finding empty seats because Serena's boyfriend had broken up with her again. "You understand," my mom had said, dialing Serena before I'd even taken off my cap. "She's more sensitive than you, more sensitive than me. So I learned to be less sensitive. I swallowed disappointment and called it maturity. I smiled when I was forgotten. I accepted crumbs and convinced myself they were enough. But standing there in that office, with Christmas music drifting faintly from someone's Spotify playlist, I finally felt the truth settle over me like cold rain. There was no version of myself small enough to make space for Serena without erasing myself completely. 2 days before Christmas, my mother didn't just uninvite me from dinner. She confirmed what I had always feared, that in my family, I was optional. After my mother hung up on me, I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't do anymore. I called my dad. There's always that stubborn, hopeful part of you that believes maybe the other parent will balance the scale. Maybe he'll say, "This isn't right. Of course you're coming home." Maybe he'll choose you just once without hesitation. I stepped outside into the cold Seattle air, letting the December wind sting my face while the phone rang. It rang 4 times before he picked up. "Hey, kiddo." His voice was casual, warm in that distant way that always made me feel 6 years old again. "Did Mom tell you?" I asked. There was a pause, long enough to tell me everything. "Yeah," he said finally. "She mentioned it." Mentioned it. Like I was a weather update. Like my absence was a minor scheduling adjustment. "And you're okay with it?" I asked, staring at the wet pavement beneath my boots. He sighed softly, and I could hear a football game playing in the background. The familiar rhythm of commentators, the comfort of routine. Your mom's just trying to keep things calm. By uninviting me from Christmas? My voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. "Dad, do you want me there?" Silence. That was always his answer. Silence dressed up as neutrality. "Kayla," he began, clearing his throat, "you know how sensitive Serena is right now. It's probably best if you give her some space this year." Something inside me stopped reaching. "I see," I said quietly. "Don't be like that," he replied, irritation slipping in around the edges. "Like what?" I asked. But he didn't explain. He never did. He specialized in vague corrections. Don't be dramatic, don't be difficult, don't be like that, without ever defining what that meant. I ended the call a minute later, and he didn't try to stop me. He didn't call back. I stood there on the sidewalk while people hurried past with shopping bags and wreaths and cups of hot chocolate, and I felt strangely hollow. Not angry, not even heartbroken, just empty. Like someone had reached inside me and scooped out the last bit of hope I didn't realize I was still holding. Christmas Eve arrived heavy and gray. Freezing rain tapped against my apartment windows in Capitol Hill, and the city felt muted, wrapped in damp quiet. I woke up expecting, ridiculously, a text, a Merry Christmas, a "We're thinking of you." Even a guilt-laced "Hope you understand." Nothing came. By noon, I'd checked my phone at least 20 times. By 3, I'd stopped pretending I wasn't waiting. Around 4, I made the mistake of opening Instagram. Serena's post was at the top of my feed, bright and polished and perfect. A family photo in my parents' living room, the tree glowing gold behind them, my mom holding the baby, smiling wide, my dad standing proudly beside her. Serena in matching pajamas with her newborn, glowing like motherhood had crowned her. The caption read, "So grateful for my little tribe. Only love here. Only love here." I stared at the photo longer than I should have, zoomed in without meaning to. Counted the stockings hanging over the fireplace. Mom, Dad, Serena, baby. 4 stockings. 4 place settings visible on the dining table behind them. No extra chair tucked off to the side. No stocking folded away just in case. No sign I'd ever existed in that room at all. It wasn't just exclusion. It was erasure. I set my phone face down on the coffee table and slid down until I was sitting on the floor with my back against the couch. My apartment felt smaller than usual. The string lights I'd hung around the window suddenly looked pathetic instead of cozy. The small artificial tree in the corner leaned slightly to one side like it was tired too. I let myself sit there for a while, long enough for the silence to feel loud, long enough for the old narrative to creep in. Maybe you are too much. Maybe you do create tension. Maybe it's easier without you there. That voice had been planted in me early, fed carefully over years. I knew it well. But something new answered it. Or maybe they just don't know how to love you properly. The thought felt rebellious, dangerous. I stood up abruptly, like if I didn't move, I'd drown in my own living room. I wasn't going to spend Christmas Eve on the floor staring at a tree that leaned like it had given up. I wasn't going to let their decision define the shape of my holiday. If I didn't have a place at their table, I would find my own. I pulled on boots and a heavy coat, wrapped a thick scarf around my neck, and stepped into the wet night with no real plan beyond don't sit alone and spiral. The streets were quiet in that eerie holiday way, storefronts dark, sidewalks nearly empty. The air smelled like rain and distant wood smoke. Most restaurants were closed. I passed dark windows and flipped chairs and signs that read, "See you after the holidays." For a moment, doubt crept back in. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should just go home, order takeout, and pretend this didn't hurt. Then I saw it. A small Italian restaurant with warm golden light spilling through fogged windows. A hand-painted sign taped to the door, "Open, Christmas Eve dinner." Through the glass, I could see movement, laughter, life. I hesitated only a second before pushing the door open. The warmth hit me instantly. Garlic, baked bread, red wine, something sweet. Conversations overlapped in comfortable noise. Plates clinked, glasses chimed. The hostess looked up at me kindly. "Just one? Just one?" "Yes," I said. She led me to a small table near a large round booth where a lively family filled the space with easy familiarity. An older couple at the center, a younger man and woman beside them. Everyone talking over each other in that affectionate way that meant no one felt ignored. I sat down at my tiny table and ordered the Christmas special, telling myself I could do this. I could eat alone. I could survive a meal. But as the food arrived, and the laughter from the booth beside me swelled and softened like a tide, something inside my chest cracked. Because I wasn't just hungry for food. I was hungry for belonging. And sitting there, surrounded by families who had chosen to gather, I finally understood something with painful clarity. I didn't miss my parents' house. I missed the idea of having one. The food looked perfect when it arrived. Golden chicken parmesan, melted mozzarella bubbling at the edges, fresh basil scattered on top like it had been placed there with intention. The pasta steamed gently, and a basket of warm bread sat beside my plate, wrapped in a linen napkin. It should have tasted like comfort. Instead, it tasted like cardboard and salt. I chewed mechanically, nodding politely when the server asked if everything was okay. "It's great," I lied, because I was very good at pretending things were fine. The booth beside me was the opposite of fine. It was alive. The older man at the center, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, wearing a red sweater that had clearly been gifted by someone who loved him, was telling a story that involved a burned turkey and a smoke detector. The younger woman, probably in her early 30s, kept swatting his arm and laughing. The older woman at his side had this way of looking at everyone when they spoke, fully, like she was storing the moment away. It wasn't loud in a chaotic way. It was loud in a safe way. Familiar. Layered with history. I tried not to stare, but my eyes kept drifting back. They passed dishes without asking. They interrupted each other without offense. When someone reached for more bread, 3 hands moved automatically to help. There was no tension. No walking on eggshells. No measuring words before speaking. It hit me then. This is what peace actually looks like. Not silence. Not absence. Not the removal of one person to make another comfortable. Peace looked like inclusion, like room being made. My throat tightened unexpectedly, and I lowered my gaze back to my plate. I told myself to focus. Eat. Finish. Go home. This was just a meal. But the ache in my chest wasn't going away. It had been building all day, quietly stacking itself behind my ribs, and now it wanted out. I swallowed hard, blinking quickly, but the tears came anyway, hot, humiliating, unstoppable. They slid down before I could catch them, landing in my lap on the edge of the table. I turned toward the window, pressing the napkin to my face, willing myself to pull it together. I didn't want to be the girl crying alone in a restaurant on Christmas Eve, but I was. "Honey?" The voice was soft, close enough that I startled. I looked up to see the older woman from the booth standing beside my table. Up close, I could see faint lines around her eyes, not from frowning, but from smiling. Her silver curls framed her face like she didn't care about taming them. She smelled faintly of vanilla and something floral. "You okay?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said automatically, swiping at my cheeks. "Just allergies." She raised one eyebrow, not skeptical, just observant. Allergies usually don't come with that expression. I let out a shaky breath that almost turned into a laugh. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make a scene." "You didn't," she said simply, "but no one should cry alone on Christmas Eve." There it was again, that word alone. The thing I'd been pretending didn't matter. I'm fine. I tried again, softer this time. Really. She studied me for a moment, and there was no pity in her expression, just recognition. You don't look fine. Something in her tone cracked through the last of my composure. Maybe it was the lack of judgment. Maybe it was the way she said it like it wasn't an accusation. My family is in Portland, I admitted quietly. I was supposed to be there. Plans changed. She nodded slowly, like she understood more than I was saying. That's hard. It was such a simple phrase, but no one in my family had ever said it like that. Hard had always been reserved for Serena. My name's Diane, she said after a moment. And I have a very loud family who insists on ordering too much food every year. We have extra seats. You're welcome to join us. I immediately shook my head. Oh, I couldn't. I don't want to intrude. You're not intruding, she said firmly. I'm inviting. She glanced back at her booth, where the silver-haired man had now noticed us and was openly eavesdropping. He lifted his glass in greeting. The younger woman smiled at me with open curiosity, not suspicion. That's my husband, Frank, Diane said. He tells terrible jokes. My daughter Mara overfeeds everyone, and my son Elliot debates politics at inappropriate times. We're flawed but friendly. Despite myself, I smiled. I don't want to ruin your night. You won't, she said without hesitation. And if you try, Frank will outdo you. From the booth, Frank called, She's right. I glanced back at my table, my half-eaten meal, the empty chair across from me, the quiet that had felt like punishment. Then I looked at Diane again. There was no calculation in her expression, no sense that I had to earn this offer, no subtle test to pass, just room. Are you sure? I asked, my voice small. I'm sure, she said. I stood slowly, grabbing my purse, my heart pounding like I was about to do something reckless instead of something kind. Diane led the way, weaving through tables with easy familiarity. When we reached the booth, everyone shifted without hesitation. Frank scooted over. Mara gathered plates to make space. Elliot smiled and said, Merry Christmas, like it was natural that I was there. Everyone, this is Kayla, Diane announced. She's joining us. And just like that, I wasn't sitting alone anymore. A plate was placed in front of me. Bread was passed to my hands before I could reach for it. Frank asked where I was from. Mara asked what I did for work. Elliot offered me more wine like I'd been coming to their Christmas dinners for years. They didn't interrogate me about why I'd been alone. They didn't make it awkward. They just made space. And as I sat there, listening to them bicker gently over who made the better lasagna, something inside me loosened for the first time all day. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking to fit. I was simply included. Sitting in that booth felt surreal at first, like I'd stepped into someone else's memory. No, not Morrison, I corrected myself. I didn't know their last name yet. Diane's family moved around me as if I'd always been there. Frank insisted I try the baked ziti because it's criminally underrated, and Mara slid a bowl of roasted vegetables toward me with a conspiratorial whisper. Ignore him. This is the real star. Elliot asked what I did for work and listened. Actually listened when I answered. No one interrupted to redirect the spotlight. No one compared my answer to Serena's accomplishments. They nodded, asked follow-up questions, laughed in the right places. It was so simple, so normal, and yet it felt revolutionary. At some point, I realized I was laughing too. Not the polite, measured laugh I used at networking events or family dinners when I was trying to keep the peace. A real one, the kind that starts in your stomach and spills out before you can censor it. Frank told a story about setting off the smoke alarm one Christmas by flambeing something he definitely shouldn't have flambéed, and Mara groaned while Diane rolled her eyes with affectionate exasperation. Elliot leaned toward me and whispered, He tells this story every year like it's new, and I felt something warm bloom in my chest. Belonging doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in shared eye rolls and refilled wine glasses. When the server brought another basket of bread, Frank tried to wave it away, but Diane nudged him and said, We have a guest, as if that explained everything. As if my presence mattered enough to justify abundance. I kept waiting for the catch, for someone to ask why I'd been alone, for the awkward silence that usually follows vulnerability. But it didn't come. Diane asked gently at one point, Are you from Seattle originally? And I told them about growing up in Portland. about moving north for work, about how I'd always wanted to live in a bigger city. I didn't say I'd been uninvited from Christmas. I didn't say my family chose my sister over me. I just spoke, and they listened. After dessert, tiramisu and a slice of chocolate cake that Mara insisted I help finish, Frank raised his glass and said, "To unexpected company." Elliot corrected him immediately. "To new friends." Diane smiled at me across the table and added softly, "To no one eating alone." They clinked glasses, and I felt my throat tighten again, but this time not from grief, from something gentler, something almost fragile in its hope. When the check came, I reached instinctively for my purse. Diane stopped me with a light touch on my wrist. "Not tonight." "I can't let you," I began. "You can," Frank said, smiling. "It's our family rule. If someone joins the table, they're our responsibility for the evening." Responsibility. The word struck me differently than it ever had before. In my family, responsibility meant managing Serena's feelings. It meant keeping quiet to avoid conflict. Here, it meant making sure no one felt alone. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. The restaurant began to empty, families bundling into coats and scarves, children yawning in their parents' arms. Diane stood and gathered her purse, then turned to me. "We host dinner most Sundays," she said casually. "Nothing fancy, too much food, too many opinions. You're welcome anytime." The offer was delivered lightly, without pressure, like she was offering me a cup of tea, not a doorway into her life. "That's really kind," I said carefully. "I don't want to impose." "You won't," Elliot said. "Trust me, we could use someone new to balance the chaos." Mara laughed. "He means to side with him when he argues with Dad." Diane squeezed my hand briefly. "The invitation stands." We stepped outside together, the cool air brushing against my cheeks. For a moment, we all stood under the awning, lingering like no one was in a hurry to let the night end. Frank shook my hand warmly. Mara hugged me without hesitation, and Elliot gave me a quick, easy smile that didn't feel loaded with expectation. "Text me," Diane said, scribbling her number on the back of a receipt and pressing it into my palm. "Even if it's just to say hello." I walked home slowly, the receipt folded carefully in my coat pocket. The city felt different somehow. The rain-slick streets reflected Christmas lights in long golden streaks, and for the first time that night, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in on other people's warmth. I felt steadier. Back in my apartment, the leaning tree didn't look quite as sad. The string lights seemed softer instead of pathetic. I hung up my coat and stood in the quiet, replaying the evening in my mind. The laughter, the easy teasing, the way Diane had looked at me like I wasn't a problem to manage, but a person worth noticing. I checked my phone out of habit. Still nothing from my family. But the silence didn't feel as sharp. I pulled the receipt from my pocket and smoothed it out on the kitchen counter. Diane's handwriting was looping and confident. I traced the numbers with my finger, hesitating only a second before saving them in my contacts. It felt small. Just a name. Just a number. And yet it felt like the beginning of something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine before. I didn't know if I'd take her up on Sunday dinner. I didn't know if this was a one-night kindness or the start of something deeper. All I knew was that for a few hours, I hadn't been the difficult daughter, the source of tension, the optional guest. I had simply been Kayla. And someone had made room for me. I didn't go to Sunday dinner the first week Diane texted me, or the second. Both times her message was simple: "We're making too much food again. Doors open at 6. No pressure, no guilt, just an open door." I stared at the messages longer than I cared to admit, thumbs hovering over the keyboard, composing and deleting responses. Maybe next time. Work is crazy. Thank you, though. Each excuse felt thin even to me. The truth was, I was afraid. It's one thing to be welcomed for a single evening, wrapped in holiday generosity and candlelight. It's another thing entirely to show up again and risk discovering it was a fluke. I knew how to survive rejection from my own family. I didn't know if I could survive being rejected by a family I'd started to hope about. So I stayed home those first 2 Sundays, telling myself I was being respectful, not imposing, not inserting myself into a space that wasn't mine. But by the 3rd week of January, Seattle had settled into that gray stretch of winter where the sky feels permanently uncommitted. Work had been exhausting. I'd spent the week revising a campaign for a client who couldn't articulate what they wanted, but knew they hated everything we presented. I'd eaten dinner alone at my kitchen counter 3 nights in a row. At 4:12 p.m. that Sunday, my phone buzzed. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, way too much pie. 6 o'clock. I stared at the message, then at my reflection in the darkened laptop screen. I looked tired, guarded, lonely. Before I could overthink it, I typed back, "Can I bring anything?" 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Just yourself. That was it. Just yourself. The simplicity of it knocked the air out of me. At 5:45, I stood on the sidewalk in front of a blue craftsman house in Ballard, clutching a bottle of red wine I'd bought at the corner store. The porch light glowed warm against the fading daylight. I could hear laughter from inside, faint but unmistakable. My heart pounded harder than it had on any first date. You can still leave, I told myself. No one would know. But the front door opened before I could retreat. Diane stood there in a flour-dusted apron, like she'd been expecting me at that exact second. "There you are," she said, smiling as if I'd merely stepped outside for air instead of debating my existence on her porch. "Come in. It's freezing." The warmth hit me instantly, not just the heat from the house, but the smell of garlic and rosemary, the low hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes. Frank was in the kitchen carving something with theatrical seriousness. Mara was at the stove stirring gravy. Elliot was leaning against the counter, arguing about basketball statistics with someone on speakerphone, and no one looked surprised to see me. "Kayla," Frank boomed. "You made it. Excellent. I need a neutral party in this gravy dispute." Mara rolled her eyes. "Don't drag her into this 5 minutes after she walks in." I held out the wine awkwardly. "I brought this." Diane took it like it was a priceless gift. "Perfect. We'll open it." There was no interrogation, no subtle test to determine my intentions. Just space. Diane took my coat and hung it beside theirs. Mara handed me a spoon and said, "Taste this and tell me if it needs more salt." Elliot asked about work and actually waited for my answer. Frank pulled out a chair and said, "You're on mashed potato duty." It was chaotic and imperfect and completely unguarded. At some point, I realized I wasn't performing. I wasn't monitoring my tone. I wasn't shrinking. When I disagreed with Elliot about a marketing strategy he'd read about, he grinned and said, "Okay, fair point," instead of accusing me of starting tension. When I laughed too loudly at one of Frank's jokes, no one flinched. Dinner stretched on for hours. Stories layered over one another. Mara talked about a difficult student in her classroom. Elliot vented about a project deadline. Frank described, in vivid detail, a hardware store mishap involving a ladder. Diane moved between us all, refilling glasses, nudging plates closer, listening with the kind of attention that made you feel chosen. Halfway through dessert, she glanced at me and asked softly, "How was your week?" It wasn't a loaded question. It wasn't code for something else. It was just care. "Long," I admitted. I kept thinking I wasn't doing enough. "For who?" Elliot asked casually. The question landed heavier than he intended. "For everyone," I said, trying to brush it off. Diane didn't let it pass, but she didn't pry either. "You don't have to earn your seat here," she said gently. There it was again, that steady clarity. "You don't have to earn your seat." I blinked quickly, focusing on my pie. "I'm still getting used to that idea." Frank leaned back in his chair. "Well, get used to it. We're stubborn." They laughed, and something inside me softened in a way I hadn't known was possible. When I left that night, Diane hugged me at the door without hesitation. "Next Sunday?" she asked. I didn't hesitate this time. "I'll be here." Walking back to my car, I felt lighter, not because my family had called or apologized or changed. They hadn't. My phone was still silent in that direction. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for them to make room for me. I had found a table where my presence wasn't conditional, and I was starting to believe I was allowed to sit there. By spring, Sunday dinners weren't an invitation anymore. They were routine. I didn't hover over my phone waiting for Diane's text. I didn't stand on the sidewalk debating whether I was welcome. I had a key. Diane pressed it into my hand one rainy afternoon in March like it was the most natural thing in the world. "For when we're running late and you get here first," she'd said. I'd stared at the small brass key resting in my palm, my throat tight. No one outside my immediate family had ever given me access to their home like that. And my immediate family had always made me feel like a guest. Now, some part of me was trusted with entry. The first time I used it, I stood on their porch for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the quiet inside. Then I unlocked the door and stepped in, calling out, "Hello? Kitchen!" Frank's voice boomed from somewhere in the back. I hung up my coat like I'd been doing it for years. That was the strange part. It didn't feel new anymore. It felt like returning. Over those months, I learned the rhythm of their house. Frank's habit of turning up the music too loud while cooking. Mara's tendency to hum absent-mindedly while chopping vegetables. Elliot's knack for showing up exactly when food was ready, claiming he'd timed it perfectly. Diane's way of orbiting us all, steady and observant, noticing when someone was quiet for too long. And they noticed me. When I got promoted to lead a small design team at work, they brought out champagne like I'd won an Oscar. When I admitted one night that I'd been having trouble sleeping, Diane showed up the next Sunday with a lavender sachet she'd sewn herself and a long lecture about bedtime routines. When I casually mentioned my car had been making a weird noise, Frank insisted on looking at it the following weekend, emerging from under the hood triumphantly greasy and proud. None of it was dramatic. It was consistent. That consistency did something to me. It rewired parts of my brain I hadn't realized were wired for disappointment. One evening in early May, I arrived to find Elliot alone in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with 2 beers already open. "Mom and Dad ran to the store," he said. "Mara's stuck in traffic, so you're stuck with me." "I'll survive," I replied, grabbing one of the beers. We stood there in easy silence for a moment. And then he asked casually, "Do you ever hear from them?" He didn't need to clarify who them was. "Not really," I said. "A text from my mom on my birthday. It said, 'Hope you're well.'" "And?" he prompted gently. And I didn't respond. He nodded once. No judgment, no lecture about forgiveness or obligation. "That's allowed," he said simply. It was such a small sentence, but it felt like someone had handed me permission I'd been waiting for my entire life. That summer, the house shifted in a way I hadn't expected. It started subtly. Elliot lingering a little longer after dinner to help me carry dishes. Texting me midweek about a design article he thought I'd find interesting. Sitting next to me on the porch instead of across the table. There was no grand moment, no sudden declaration, just a steady narrowing of space between us. One night in July, after everyone else had gone inside, we stayed on the back steps watching the sunset smear pink and gold across the sky. The air smelled like grilled corn and cut grass. Fireflies blinked lazily over the yard. "You know," he said, nudging my shoulder lightly, "my mom hasn't stopped talking about the night she met you." I laughed. "That's slightly terrifying." "She says she knew you were coming back." "I didn't," I admitted. He studied me for a second, not in a way that felt invasive, just thoughtful. "I'm glad you did." There was something in his tone that made my chest tighten. Not pressure, not expectation, just sincerity. "I am too," I said quietly. He reached for my hand then, not dramatically, not like it was a performance, just laced his fingers through mine as if it had already been decided. It felt less like something starting and more like something being acknowledged. Dating Elliot didn't disrupt Sunday dinners. It didn't turn the house into a battlefield of awkwardness. Diane raised an eyebrow the first time she noticed us sitting closer than usual, but she didn't interrogate. Frank just grinned and muttered something about, "Finally." What surprised me most wasn't how natural it felt to fall in love with him. It was how safe it felt. There were no games, no silent treatments, no threats of withdrawal if I said the wrong thing. When we disagreed, we talked. When I got overwhelmed at work and snapped at him one evening, he didn't accuse me of being dramatic. He asked what was underneath it. No one had ever asked me that before. Underneath it was fear. Fear that if I relaxed too much, if I leaned in too far, I'd lose this too. But as summer stretched on and Sundays turned into a full year of showing up, I began to understand something that changed me more than any confrontation with my parents ever could. Love isn't proven in grand speeches. It's proven in who keeps pulling out a chair for you. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for a seat. I was already home. By the time Elliot proposed, it didn't feel like a sudden shift. It felt like a continuation of something that had been unfolding quietly for months, maybe even since that first Christmas Eve. We built our relationship the same way his family built their Sunday dinners, steadily, intentionally, without theatrics. So when he asked me to marry him on a windswept stretch of Cannon Beach the following spring, it felt less like a question and more like a promise we'd already been keeping. We were standing barefoot in the cold sand, the ocean roaring behind us, our shoes abandoned near a driftwood log. He'd been oddly quiet all morning, which should have tipped me off, but I'd chalked it up to caffeine deprivation. When he finally turned to face me, the wind catching his hair and pushing it into his eyes, his expression was so unguarded it made my chest tighten. "Kayla," he said, voice nearly swallowed by the surf, "I've watched you rebuild yourself from the ground up. I've watched you choose joy even when it would have been easier to stay bitter. I don't ever want to build a life without you in it." He knelt in the sand, not caring that his jeans were getting soaked, and held out a small velvet box. My breath caught, and for a split second, I saw flashes of my past. My mother's flat voice, my father's silence, the empty chair at Christmas. Then I saw Diane's kitchen, Frank's laughter, Mara arguing about salt, Elliot's steady hand in mine. "Yes," I said before he could even finish the question. "Yes." When we told his family, Diane cried so hard she had to sit down. Frank hugged Elliot with a clap on the back so hard it nearly knocked him over. Mara screamed and demanded to see the ring. It was chaotic and loud and full of warmth. No one asked if I'd told my parents. No one assumed they'd be involved. But as wedding planning began, venues, guest lists, flowers, caterers, one question kept resurfacing like a bruise I hadn't fully acknowledged. "What do you write on the invitation under Parents of the Bride?" The first time I saw the sample layout from the printer, my throat closed. There it was in elegant script. "Together with their families," plural. I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a year. After that Christmas, the silence between us stretched and calcified. My mother sent one clipped birthday text. My father called once and left a voicemail that said, "Hope you're doing okay," in a tone that sounded more like obligation than longing. I never called back. It wasn't dramatic. It was just over. Still, blood has a way of lingering in your mind. Obligation doesn't dissolve overnight. One evening, I found myself sitting at Diane's kitchen table long after everyone else had drifted out of the room. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and leftover lasagna. She was folding napkins across from me, her movements unhurried. "You've been quiet," she said gently. I hesitated. "The invitations," I admitted. "There's a line for the parents of the bride." She didn't flinch. "And you're not sure what to put?" I shook my head. It feels dishonest to list my parents like everything's fine, but it also feels final not to. Diane set the napkin down and looked at me fully. "Final doesn't mean wrong," I swallowed. "Do you think I'm being cruel?" She reached across the table and took my hand. "Kayla, love isn't proven by proximity. It's proven by presence. Who has been present in your life these past years?" The answer rose immediately. "You," I whispered. She smiled softly. "Then maybe the invitation should reflect that." The idea felt radical, audacious, but also right. A week later, Elliot and I made a decision that would have terrified the version of me from 2 years ago. We filed paperwork for adult adoption. It wasn't impulsive. Diane had mentioned it once in passing months earlier, explaining how the law can formalize chosen family bonds. At the time, I'd tucked the idea away like something too precious to touch. Now, it felt like stepping fully into the life I'd already been living. The process took months, forms, signatures, a brief court appearance. It wasn't emotional in the way I expected. It was calm, intentional. The judge smiled kindly when she finalized it, and just like that, I legally became Kayla Bennett. Diane and Frank Bennett, parents of the bride. When the invitations arrived, crisp and cream-colored, I traced the printed words with trembling fingers. "With joyful hearts, Diane and Frank Bennett invite you to celebrate the marriage of their daughter, Kayla Bennett, to Elliot Bennett, daughter." The word no longer felt borrowed. I should have known news would travel. My mother called 3 times in one afternoon, once the invitations circulated beyond Seattle. I let it go to voicemail. The message she left was clipped, tight with indignation. "You can't just erase us," she said. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the pull to defend myself. Because I wasn't erasing them, I was choosing myself. The wedding day arrived bright and windless, set in a vineyard just outside Woodinville. As I stood in the bridal suite, Diane adjusting my veil with careful hands, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't see the girl who'd sat alone in an Italian restaurant 2 Christmases ago. I saw a woman who had stopped begging for love and started accepting it where it was freely given. "You look beautiful," Diane whispered. "Thank you," I said, then added, voice steady, "Mom." Her eyes filled instantly, but she didn't cry. Outside, guests were gathering. Elliot was waiting at the altar, and for the first time in my life, the word family didn't feel like a wound. It felt like something I had built. The ceremony itself felt like stepping into sunlight after years of standing in shadow. Elliot was waiting for me at the end of the aisle, hands clasped tightly in front of him, trying and failing to look calm. Frank stood beside him, pretending not to be emotional, though his eyes were already suspiciously glossy. Mara adjusted my bouquet one last time before giving me a wink and slipping into her seat. Diane squeezed my hands just before the music began. "Ready, sweetheart?" she asked softly. I nodded. When the doors opened and I stepped forward, the world narrowed to the length of that aisle. The vineyard stretched out behind the guests in rows of green and gold, sunlight glinting off glasses and camera lenses. But all I really saw was Elliot's face. There was no hesitation in his expression. No doubt. Just certainty. Halfway down the aisle, I felt it fully, the absence of dread. I wasn't scanning the crowd for disapproval. I wasn't bracing for conflict. I wasn't waiting for someone to withdraw their support at the last minute. I was walking towards something that had chosen me back. Frank met me at the front and kissed my cheek before placing my hand in Elliot's. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "Always," Elliot replied. The vows we'd written were simple, honest. No grand metaphors or dramatic promises, just commitments to show up, to communicate, to protect the life we were building. When the officiant pronounced us married, the applause felt like a wave lifting us forward. Elliot kissed me, and for a second, I forgot about everything else. But life has a way of reminding you that healing doesn't erase the past. It simply reframes it. The reception had just begun when one of the venue coordinators approached Diane with a tight expression. I watched from across the patio as she listened, her posture shifting subtly. Then she looked toward me. Elliot saw it too. "What is it?" he murmured. Diane approached, calm but alert. "Your parents are here," she said quietly. The words landed with less force than I expected. "Both of them?" I asked. She nodded. For a brief second, the old reflex tried to surface, the urge to panic, to accommodate, to smooth things over. But it didn't take hold. Instead, I felt something steadier rise in its place. "Are they causing a scene?" I asked. "No," Diane said. "They're asking to speak with you." Elliot's jaw tightened. "We can have them escorted out." I looked at him, at the concern in his eyes. "No," I said gently. "I'll talk to them." We walked together toward the entrance of the venue, where my parents stood awkwardly near the check-in table. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. My father older. Time had touched them in ways I hadn't witnessed. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my mother broke the silence. "We deserve to hear about this from you." I studied her face. The familiar lines, the familiar tightness around her mouth, the same voice that had once told me not to come home. "I sent an invitation," I said evenly. "You changed your name," she shot back. "You let strangers adopt you." "They aren't strangers," I replied. "They're my family." My father shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Kayla," he began, voice softer, "we made mistakes." The word mistakes felt thin against the weight of years. "I know," I said. My mother's eyes flicked past me toward the laughter drifting from the reception area. "So that's it? You replace us?" I took a breath, not to calm myself, but to speak clearly. "I didn't replace you," I said. "You stepped back. They stepped forward." Silence. My father looked at me the way he used to when I was small and trying to explain something important. Only this time, he wasn't the authority in the conversation. "We didn't think you'd actually cut us off." My mother admitted, and there it was, the assumption. The belief that I would always come back, always accept less. "I didn't cut you off," I said. "I stopped chasing you." That seemed to land. For a long moment, we simply stood there, the hum of celebration behind me, the weight of history between us. "Can we at least stay?" my father asked quietly. I thought about it, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. "They can sit in the back," I told the coordinator. "But they're guests. Nothing more." My mother bristled at that, but my father nodded. When we returned to the reception, Diane slipped her arm through mine without asking questions. Frank clapped Elliot on the shoulder. Mara handed me a glass of champagne. No one demanded an explanation. No one made it dramatic. Later, during the speeches, Frank stood and raised his glass. "To our daughter," he said, voice steady, "who taught us that family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up." Applause rippled across the vineyard. I didn't look toward the back where my biological parents sat. I didn't need to, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't measuring my worth by who failed to claim me. I was surrounded by people who had. That night, long after the music faded and the guests drifted away, Elliot and I stood alone under the string lights still glowing softly over the empty tables. "Are you okay?" he asked. I smiled, not the careful smile I'd learned as a child, but a real one. "I am," I said. And I meant it. Because the girl who once sat alone in a restaurant believing she was too much had grown into a woman who understood something fundamental. Being unwanted by the wrong people does not make you unworthy. It just makes space for the right ones to find you. And this time, when I walked toward my future, I wasn't hoping someone would let me stay. I knew I belonged,